AA.
A few years ago, I was able to purchase a 2003 John Deere Gator through govdeals.com. This Gator was used and abused, but with a little work I was able to get it up and running. It has been a good farm tool ever since, that is, until the motor died. All of my attempts to revive it failed, and that's when I found the Gator Guy. The Gator Guy sells rebuilt Gator motors that are essentially one-for-one swap. This video is a review of that product and the process of swapping it out. The motor I was removing was old and crusty, and I am not a mechanic. However, with a little research, I was able to put together a list of steps it should get me through. Having said that, this is not a how-to video as much as this is what I did video. I hope you find it helpful. The first step is to remove the bed. First, with the bed down, remove the nuts from the hinge bolts. Leave the bolts in. Raise the bed and remove the pin from the upper mechanism. Lower the bed and remove the hinge bolts, upper pin, and spacers. Then lift the bed off the Gator. The next step is to disconnect the battery. Disconnecting the battery minimizes the chances of unexpected electrical surprises during the rest of the motor removal process. These are typically 10mm nuts and bolts and oftentimes requires 2 wrenches to complete. Start with the negative terminal. Since a negative terminal is grounded, there will be no sparks if you accidentally touch a conductive surface with your wrench during the process. With the negative terminal disconnected, the path for current flow is interrupted, and you shouldn't have any electrical surprises while removing the positive terminal either. Leave the wires bolted together after they are removed from the terminals. This will simplify the assembly process later. It's also not a bad idea to take plenty of pictures before you start taking things apart. This can be especially important if you're not very familiar with how automotive systems are wired together. Loosen the strap and remove the battery after the wires are disconnected and out of the way. Disconnect all wires going to the motor. Take pictures. I can't emphasize this enough. While the plugs are fairly straightforward and would be hard to mix up, that can't be said for the wires going directly to the motor. Specifically, take pictures of the starter connections and the grounding connections. These pictures will be especially useful during the assembly process if there's any confusion. Once all the wires are disconnected, make sure you move them out of the way and secure them so that they'll be out of the way and won't snag on anything when you're lifting the motor out of the engine compartment. Remove the air filter. Removing the air filter is really no big deal. It's one bolt and one hose clamp. And to be honest, you could do that before disconnecting the electrical connections or after. Either way is fine. It's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to do. I think though, if you remove your air filter before your electrical, it may make it a little easier to get to some of the plugs and some of the connections themselves. I guess it depends on how congested your engine compartment is. Disconnect the choke and throttle. We'll start out with the choke. It's pretty easy because it's there and exposed. All you need to do is just loosen the nut that holds the choke in place, and then you just simply uncouple the wire from the slot connected to the choke on the carburetor. To disconnect the throttle, you have to remove a cover plate that's held in place by 3 sheet metal screws. Unfortunately, in my situation, one of those screws was stripped into the metal surface of the cover. So once I was able to loosen the other 2 screws, then I thought the best solution would be simply bend the sheet metal cover up to give myself access, remove the throttle cable, and then I'd worry about getting the cover off of the top of the motor after the motor is taken out of the engine compartment. Overall, it wasn't too bad, except there's a pin that holds the throttle in place onto the throttle lever, and that was stuck. So even though I kind of blocked the view with my hand there, I had to use a screwdriver to get in there and kind of wiggle it around a little bit and loosen it up. But once it loosened up, it then dropped down onto the motor itself, and I had to fish it out. But again, really not a big deal. Once the throttle was disconnected, I then took the pin and placed it back in the hole there on the top of the motor, just so I could keep track of it. It will be needed later when installing the new motor. That seemed like a good place to keep it. Disconnect the fuel line. Disconnecting the fuel line is pretty simple. It's easy to get to. I took a bucket just in case there was some fuel in the line itself, which I was pretty sure there wasn't, but wanted to have the bucket there just in case. You just simply pinch the clip with some needle nose pliers, slide it down the hose a little bit, and then it should pull right off the carburetor. If you do have some fluid trapped in the line, having the bucket there, or at least some rags to absorb it, is a good precautionary measure. Better to do it up front than have a spill. Disconnect the coolant lines. Now, for the coolant lines, you definitely want to have a bucket. I also added a little bit of sawdust underneath the Gator just to, because I was almost 100% sure I was going to spill at least a little bit, and I wanted to have something there to absorb it. So you have 2 coolant lines, an in and an out, and you just simply loosen the hose clamp for each one. Pull the hose off the motor, drain it into the bucket, and then I kept the hose clamps on the hose so that they would be in a nice safe place, because again, this is something that you'll need to use again when you install your new motor. I also noticed that the belt also interfered a little bit with getting that hose off, or at least dumping it into the bucket. It might be advantageous to take the belt off before you disconnect the coolant lines. I guess that's just a personal choice. Remove the exhaust. Removing the exhaust system is going to be a challenge, no matter how or when you do it. So I included this little picture here to show you where all the connection pieces are. I believe the individual exhaust ports required a 10 millimeter and the mounting bolts a 13 millimeter. Unfortunately, the mounting bolts are very hard to get to with the motor in place, and thinking about this after the fact, it might be easier. I don't know because I didn't do it, but it might be easier to lift the motor out before you remove the exhaust and before you remove the clutch and do all of that on a workbench. I don't, like I said, I don't know. Eventually I was able to get it and get to the individual bolts, but they are not very accessible and you don't have very much range of motion to be able to get them out. Disconnecting the exhaust ports themselves, that part was pretty simple. Once I got the nuts off the exhaust ports, I then got a set of needle nose pliers to go ahead and remove the little lock washers. Otherwise, I'm sure I would have dropped those, and I hate fishing for small components like that. You may notice that I set everything there on a little magnetic pad. I love that thing. That's been one of the best tool additions that I've had in quite some time. Everything can sit there without rolling off and without dropping down and getting lost. As far as the individual mounting bolts, you just have to be patient, or at least the way that I did it, I had to be patient and just work at it very slowly. Again, you have almost no range of motion in there to loosen things, so it took some time, and eventually I got it. As you'll see, everything came out without too much difficulty. It was just patience and time. Remove the belt. Removing the belt involves, first of all, just getting the belt guard out of the way. That's one bolt, one nut, and comes apart fairly easily. It's very accessible. You loosen that, move the guard out of the way, and then you can simply work the belt off the pulley. Be sure and inspect the belt carefully after you take it out. My belt was in very good shape, and so I was able to reuse that with the new motor. One thing that I did not realize prior to taking off the belt is that the belt itself is directional, and so you want to make sure that you put that on the right way for the new motor. We'll get to that topic here in a little bit. Remove the motor mounting bolts. When I was doing my research on how to accomplish this motor swap, the only video that I found was someone that showed details of someone removing the motor is they jacked up the Gator and then removed the two rear tires to give themselves access. The way that I wanted to do this was to still have the flexibility of being able to move the Gator in and out of my garage in between steps. So I didn't want to limit the mobility by putting it up on jacks and then having to take it down and getting under to loosen everything. It is the bolts. There are only 4 bolts holding the motor in place, and as you can see, you can access them from above, but there are some of them where it's simpler to get down at ground level and come in and do it that way as well. So however you decide to do it, again, I had access from the top, and for me that worked out, but I can also see that if you jack it up and get under it that way, that accessibility is is pretty easy in doing it that way as well. Whatever works for you, this is what worked for me. And it was pretty easy and pretty straightforward. Lift the motor out of the Gator. I'm pretty sure that one or two people could lift that motor out without too much difficulty. But I'm old and I didn't have any help, so I went ahead and lifted the motor out with my tractor, and also the use of some straps given to me by some of my German colleagues. There weren't good places to actually lift from, so I did a little bit of a redneck wrap job. I don't recommend doing that, but it worked for me. Removing the clutch to use on the new motor. I saw several online examples of people struggling to swap out the clutch. For me personally, I didn't have any real issues. First, I removed the outer cover. And then remove the bolt that holds the clutch onto the tapered shaft. And then I was ready to extract the clutch itself from the shaft. There is a specialized clutch removal tool that you can purchase. It's available on Amazon or through John Deere, or if you're not going to get into the clutch removal business, you can make the tool for yourself using the specs that I've shown here. You insert the half-inch shaft into the hole and then use the 9/16 bolt to go ahead and drive against that shaft until it backs the clutch away from the tapered shaft itself. To me, it worked fairly easily. Now, one suggestion that was made to make that easier if you ever have to do it again is to go ahead and put some anti-seize on your new motor shaft, which is what I am showing right here. I went ahead and did that. It seemed like a good idea to me. But again, the removal process in my specific case was not very difficult at all. If you experience problems, I did find quite a few videos on YouTube that gives examples on how other people have done it. For me, it was pretty straightforward. Once you apply a nice even coat of anti-seize on the tapered shaft, you can go ahead and take the clutch, put that on the tapered shaft, and then drive in the bolt that holds that in place. Now, one thing that I could not find either in the technical documentation or anywhere online was an official torque specification for what that should be set for, but based on similar bolts used by John Deere, I decided on 40 foot-pounds as being a good amount. So I used a torque wrench, used a second wrench to go ahead and keep the clutch from rotating, and then used a torque wrench to ensure that I've tightened that down in a way that should hold for the future. Once it was torqued down, put the cover back on. There should also be a little FME, a foreign material exclusion cover that goes over that open hole there in the cover. I don't have that, so I'm going to see if I can get something to cover that hole. But I guess it's been that way for years, and I really didn't find a lot of debris inside there, even though the rest of my engine compartment was full of mud and sticks and every other kind of nasty little thing that you don't want to run into. I didn't find anything inside the clutch, so I think even without the cover it should be okay. Install the spark plugs. The Gator Guy ships the new motor without spark plugs installed. According to the note that I found with the shipment, is that they oftentimes get broken off during transportation, and that's why he ships them that way. This just seemed to be like a really good time to go ahead and install the spark plugs with everything accessible and easy to see, easy to access. So that's what I did. Install the new motor in the engine compartment. Secure the motor with the motor mounting bolts. I set the motor in place using the tractor again. No real need to show that unless you really want to see it. If so, send me a message and I'll send you the video, but that's pretty straightforward. What I did, just to be a little bit different, is then I'm showing installation of the bolts from underneath instead of doing it from the top like I showed during the removal process. So in this case, I'm coming at it from underneath with one hand, and with the other hand I'm reaching around and shifting the motor a little bit one way or the other until I can line the bolts up. Once the first bolt is lined up and screwed hand tight into place, the other bolts lined up fairly easily. It was just getting that first one and getting access to that was a little bit of a trick, but nothing really serious. For this initial portion, I just secured the engine with the bolts finger tight, and then went back later and tightened everything up once I was sure that everything was in place and I didn't need to move things around any at all in order to be able to connect to things like the belts and the hoses and everything else. Install the belt. Earlier, you may recall that I mentioned the belt is directional. I didn't really realize that when I first installed it here and had to go back later and fix that, which I'll show a little bit later in the video, just so that you can see it in the correct direction. Here I installed it with the arrows facing toward the rear of the Gator. For the 2003 6x4, the arrows should face the driver and not the rear of the vehicle. That's just so that you know for your own reference. You should check to see whether or not that applies to yours or if it could be something different. Here also, while installing the belt, there is a stiffening bar that maintains the distance between the transmission and the drive motor itself. Interestingly enough, that was not connected when I originally disassembled everything and removed the original motor. So I don't know what happened there. There wasn't a bolt for it, so I had to go find a 13 millimeter bolt and put that in. It mounts right next to the mounting bolts for the exhaust system. But again, it was fairly simple and obvious where it was supposed to go. Install the exhaust system. The exhaust system goes on just the opposite of how it came off. You have two nuts and washers, two locked washers on each of the exhaust ports. Also for the exhaust ports themselves, you have two metal gaskets. I reused the ones that came with the old motor, and then one small mounting bracket that I'm not really sure what it's used for, but it was on the original motor, so I used it again. Again, just like the removal, there's very little room to work with. It's a little bit cumbersome. I connected the exhaust ports first and just snugged those up a little bit to keep everything lined up, and then slowly and carefully worked on the three mounting bolts. I do believe that you can mount the exhaust while the motor is still out before you place the motor in the engine compartment, and mount the exhaust before putting the clutch on, and it would probably be easier, but that would make setting the motor in place in the in the engine compartment a little more difficult, a little harder to work with. But if you have two people, that might be the better way to go. As it is, I just work slowly and carefully. Got everything in there. I didn't have any specific torque specs, so I made everything German tight. In other words, coolant tight. Just to make sure that it doesn't come off during operation, and from time to time I'll go ahead and check those and make sure that they're not loosening up. Connecting the belt cover. There's really nothing magical about connecting the belt cover. It's just a matter of inserting the bolt and securing the nut. Even so, it's kind of a necessary step to protect the belt during operation. Choke and throttle installation. Installing the choke and throttle cables are really just a reverse of the disassembly process. It's just a matter of routing the cables so that they won't interfere with anything, and then putting them back into place and securing the nut itself. Here for the choke, you simply rotate the choke on the carburetor around to where you can get the little nut or whatever you call it at the end of the cable into the hole, and then rotate it back around and it holds itself in place. For the throttle, I decided to insert the pin from the bottom up, just like I found it. I don't know that that's the right way for sure, but it makes sense to me, and it makes it easiest to be able to get the clip into place to keep it from falling out during operation. If you know a better way to do it, by all means, don't hesitate to let me know. As you can see, I had a little bit of trouble holding on to the pin. So eventually what I did is just simply grab some needle nose pliers, feed it up through the bottom, then push it up, and then from there put the clip on. To me, it wasn't really obvious when the clip had clicked into place. Usually you feel that pretty easily. I didn't feel it, so I had to go back and just check it a little bit more, just make sure it's in place. But overall it went in fairly easily, and I didn't see any binding or anything during operation, so I'm pretty confident that this is the way it's supposed to be. Of course, once the choke and the throttle are in place, you've got to tighten the nut to keep them from falling out during operation. And then we should be set and ready to go. I always recommend testing things to make sure that they operate smoothly. And here you can see that they functioned without any problems. Connecting the coolant lines. Just like so many of the steps here at this point, this is really just a reverse of the disassembly process. The hoses went on pretty easily, and there were no real routing problems or interference issues. I think the one thing that I could have done, and I did have to go back and do later, is maybe trim off an inch or so of each one of the hoses so that I've got a fresh connection point and fresh crimping surface. I did have a very minor coolant leak on startup, but then going back, removing the hoses and fixing that later was not a big issue. I just could have prevented that from the beginning. I had taken a little break at this point, and I don't know, maybe went and ate lunch or something. I don't know what it was, but it got me thinking about the belt direction, and I went back and I checked it and I looked in the technical documentation and realized that I had installed the belt with the arrows in the wrong direction. Again, for my model and my type of Gator, the arrows on the belt need to be facing the driver or the front end of the vehicle and not the rear. I had it the opposite. So I had to go back, loosen the belt cover, and then remove the belt, put it back on, and then reassemble everything. The reason I'm showing this is so that hopefully this is something that you check and are able to prevent having to redo yourself. And also this gives an isolated place, start to finish, of removing and reinstalling the belt. Electrical connections. For the most part, the electrical connections are pretty simple, at least the plug portion of it, because at least on my Gator, no two plugs are the same, so you can't accidentally mix things up. They matched up, the new motor matched up very well with the existing plugs. They were the same as the motor that came off originally, so no confusion, pretty straightforward, plug for plug, connection for connection. The place where I struggled a little bit was in the actual connections to what went to the main motor, specifically to the starter connection and to the grounding connection on the motor, and that's what we're going to get to next. I actually had to pause because I didn't take as good of pictures as what I should have. I had to pause and go back and review video and review things that I had taken pictures of to really come to a final conclusion where some of the wires connected to. Now, after the main plugs, you do have one additional plug that goes over to control the lift mechanism, and that's together in a bundle with the two relays for the up and down, which are shown right here. On my Gator, those weren't actually mounted, so obviously somebody had done some work with those at some point in time and didn't connect them. I later went back and found where they connected and connected those up, or mounted them to the frame. Here, though, what I'm showing is the main positive connection going to the starter motor, and then there is a small bundle of wires that also connects on that same terminal. That's all screwed together, and that goes directly to the positive of the battery. And then once those are connected down and the bolts tightened up, then it's a really good idea to go ahead and take the red rubber cover and cover up those exposed positive connections, so that you don't actually end up with a short at some point in time. Once I got that insulative cover over the positive terminals, it was then time to go ahead and connect the grounding connections. There are a couple places where you can insert a screw on the block. There are holes already, threaded holes already on the block to be able to do this, and that will be the lead going directly to the battery, as well as another grounding lead that goes to some of the electronic controls. Battery connection. Connecting the battery is pretty basic and simple. The one thing that I would advise is to always connect the positive terminal first. I did that, I just didn't film it. And then connect your negative terminal. In doing it this way, of course, you don't create a short circuit to ground situation should you accidentally touch some of your tools to something that's grounded. By connecting the positive first, you don't have a complete path for current flow, and therefore you won't get a spark. And connecting the negative second, it's the same thing. Once you have connected your positive and negative, then of course strap your battery down using the bungee cord and attach it to the Gator. Connect the fuel line and the carburetor overflow. I used a clamp on my fuel line to, just in case any fuel was still in the line, it wouldn't leak out while I was changing out the motor. Unclamp that, connect your fuel line to your carburetor, and then using needle nose pliers or something similar, take the little clip and move it up so that it clamps on tightly to the carburetor and you won't have fuel leakage. Of course, you have to give it the little wiggle to make sure that it's on tight. Using the same basic procedure, take the carburetor overflow. I had to take it off of the old carburetor to reuse it on this one, but you simply clip it on or slide it into the connection on the carburetor, and then take a pair of needle nose pliers and take the little clamp, slide it up into position so that it's on there tightly. Air filter installation. The air filter installation is exactly the opposite procedure as it was to remove it. You have one nut and bolt that has to be secured, and then of course you have the hose clamp that's going to the air intake on the carburetor. Once those are properly installed and secured, that's pretty much for your air filter. Of course, while the air filter's off, it's a good time to go ahead and check it and make sure that it's clean and usable. If not, it's a good time to change it out. Filling the coolant system. Filling the cooling system is not difficult, but it must be done in a specific way in order to avoid problems. It is a well-documented issue with the water-cooled Gators that they do have cooling system issues. Many of those issues are because air gets trapped in the system. When air gets trapped in the system, the coolant doesn't circulate properly and it causes isolated overheating in the engine, which can lead to damage. Therefore, when filling the cooling system, first take off the radiator cap, ensure it's cool enough to do so, and then also remove the bleeder bolt that is located just aft of the carburetor. When filling, keep an eye on that bleeder hole and watch for coolant to start coming up out of the hole. Then you know that you've properly filled the system and pushed most of the air out. Now, it's possible that you may need to go back and continue to bleed the system after that. I'm not going to cover that here. That's something that you can get out of the service manual. There is a procedure and process to do that. But when you're filling, just make sure that you have done it this way. Then put the bolt back in, tighten that up, and you should be relatively full at that point. The last step in the filling process is then to ensure that you have adequate reserve coolant in the reservoir. To do that, you simply remove the cap and the suction hose, and then go ahead and fill that to approximately 2 to 3 inches in the reservoir. It's also, they make a point of pointing out that when you put the cap back in, that the hose is not either too long or too short. Either one of those can cause that not to work correctly by either not being able to take suction or getting the end of that trapped against the bottom and also not being able to take a suction, rendering the reservoir fairly useless. Add motor oil. The technical documentation has a chart for the motor oil to use. The most common and the type that was recommended by the Gator Guy is 10W30. There was no real specification for whether or not it should be synthetic or not, but doing a quick search online, most people recommended using synthetic, so that's what I went with. Full synthetic 10W30. Just as a side note, that cap does not spin off, it pulls off. I had forgotten about that. I knew that, but I had forgotten that. And you saw me trying to spin it. But really, if you just work it back and forth a little bit, you can pull it right off and it shouldn't be a problem. Continue filling. It's 1.3 quarts. Continue filling until you see the level come up to where you need it to be. There's nothing hurts checking multiple times and taking it slow and easy, because this is kind of an important step. A motor without oil doesn't last very long. Drain the old fuel if necessary. One of the reasons the previous motor failed was because of bad fuel. So I want to make sure that I don't introduce even a hint of bad fuel into the new motor. I've flushed the engine, or I've flushed the gas tank several times already, and I want to just make sure we get any remaining fuel that may be in there out and fill it with fresh fuel so that we don't ruin the new engine. So with the with the fuel pump unplugged, go ahead and take the fuel line off the carburetor, then plug the fuel line or the fuel pump back in, turn on the ignition without actually starting the motor or without activating the starter, and let it drain into a bucket or some other type of container, and get all the old fuel out that you can. Once you're sure that you're very well drained, then go ahead and turn off the ignition, reconnect the fuel line, and you should be ready for putting good fuel or new fuel back in the tank and doing your initial test firing. Initial startup and test drive. So overall, I'm pretty happy. I mean, it started up pretty easily. It runs pretty good. A few adjustments still need to be made, but not a big deal. Now time to put the bed back on and really take it out and run it through its paces. But overall, pretty fun process. And even though I'm not a mechanic, I was able to get this done, I think, pretty well. So my overall impression of the Gator Guy is very positive. Correspondence was very simple. He got back to me always within a day or so. He gave me a price. He actually included return labels so I could send back the old motor. The packaging was good. Communication again was very good. He lets you know exactly what he wants and when he wants it, and you know, something that's something that I really like in a business, and I'm very happy with the result. So I recommend him highly. If this is something you need, I would recommend that you reach out, and if he can't help you out, perhaps he can point you to someone who will. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least learned something, and let me know in the comments what you think.